Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism. Today we're doing a video on something I bet a lot of you may not have heard of. I think a lot of you have though, because we've gotten a lot of emails about this. Something called limerence. And if you understand limerence, you might understand some of your vulnerabilities to a narcissistic relationship. So let's talk about limerence. What is it? It's a strange word. I actually had to do a lot of research on this and even go to some original relational texts. It appears that it was developed in the 1970s by someone named Dr. Dorothy Tenov. I, again, didn't know much about it. I had to read about it. So it's not a term I'd ever come up in the years of my own time in graduate school and training. It's actually a term that has not been researched a lot, but it is basically an obsessive infatuation with someone and an obsessive desire to have those feelings reciprocated. The wanting the feelings to be reciprocated, to be mirrored back, is a big part of limerence. It's a desire to be loved by that person you are intensely attached to, kind of in your mind. Apparently, it doesn't always have to be sexual, but it is an obsessive, love-like feeling. Limerence often plays out largely in someone's head, and a person may remain obsessed about someone they've only met a few times and have a really richly developed fantasy world about them in their head. Limerence situations are often unrequited, meaning that it's someone thinking about, that the person they're thinking about, but the relationship doesn't happen or really can't happen. Usually there might be a few bits of encouragement thrown in there or some contact that can keep the limerence experience stoked and fueled. But by and large, the actual limerence relationship tends to not actually happen in real life. In the era of social media, it seems like limerence could be on the rise. You know, we see a carefully edited and curated image of a person's life. They're very attractive, very interested. It's easy to have a coy, maybe even flirty DM here and there. And for some people, it could feel as though they're even posting those messages just for you. People can get obsessed by the person whose life they are witnessing on social media. And the platforms allow the tools to communicate with the person, which only adds to the infatuation and the obsession, as though there could be some real possibility. And it could just distract a person who may literally spend their time studying and tracking the social media posts of this person they have this limerence relationship with. Limerence often means lots of big ups and downs, a big dopamine rush when the limerent object responds to you or notices you, and then a crash and despair when that's not happening. The limerent person desperately wants their love to be reciprocated. Limerence largely, again, like I said, though, plays out in a person's head. So depending on how rich the fantasy life is, the limerent person's observed ups and downs, like people looking at them, might say, wow, they got a lot of ups and downs, relate to the fantasy. Limerence can also result in intrusive thoughts. The person can't stop thinking about this other person, and the intrusive thoughts may interrupt work, school, other relationships, and just life in general. One thing that appears to be the case is that limerence is really fueled by how it gets constructed in the limerent person's head. In a way, the narrative that is being constructed is not fully based in reality. The limerent person may one day actually get to meet the object of obsession and be infatuated, but from that point on, a lot of the relationship is based on obsessive fantasizing. When we look at limerence in the larger framework of love, we know that the sort of infatuated love we see in limerence is not likely to last. It sort of burns hot and then fades, almost like a supernova. In order for a relationship to evolve, it has to grow into a more respectful, companionate love. By and large, that's not what limerence is. I didn't know much about limerence, and so when I went down the rabbit hole, I've been researching it for a little while, my blood did sort of run cold, because it really did in some ways feel like the structural skeleton for a narcissistic relationship and even trauma bonding. It's based on a sort of created narrative that blocks a person from seeing red flags. It has those dopamine-driven early vibes that mirror love bombing. It's obsessive, which is something we might see in a trauma-bonded relationship. And because it may be the case that limerence isn't reciprocated, And that idea of being infatuated and obsessed without it being fully reciprocated is very much the structure of the trauma-bonded relationship. And even the idea that tiny little reinforcements, tiny little messages, are enough to keep a person on the chain. Infatuation is never good because it pulls a person out of life, which is very congruent with love bombing too. Your emotions may even get dictated by whether the limerent object reciprocates or not. Personally, after researching this, I think limerence sounds a lot like trauma bonding and love bombing. The original theorist who made this word and others have stated that if limerent folks can ultimately find a balance in this relationship, that it sometimes can go on to a healthy relationship. Personally, I'm not seeing it. Obsession and healthy don't tend to fall into the same sentence that often. But where limerence actually takes a turn and gets a little interesting again is that this may not just be the experience of a person who gets pulled into a narcissistic relationship, but limerence may also be something that a narcissist themselves experience. Limerence feels a bit superficial. Fantasy, obsession, infatuation, needing validation, the chase, the wanting to get the new person to notice them. That's how a narcissistic person goes into a relationship. And when you add into it that just like any new obsessive relationship, it's reward-oriented and sort of dopamine-y, narcissistic folks are very reward-sensitive and might enjoy this kind of a ride. Limerence can also be quite problematic for people who are in existing committed relationships. The limerent person may find themselves developing strong feelings for someone outside of their primary relationship. They might meet someone else and for one time get caught in the fantasy of it all, the obsession, the infatuation, and no longer bring any emotional energy to their existing relationship. Even if they don't act on it, it can feel like a betrayal to the person in the existing relationship. And this pattern isn't unusual for narcissistic folks who will become obsessed with someone outside of their primary relationship, largely because they are so novelty-seeking. And with narcissists, you can all but guarantee they'll probably follow through on it and say, oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. There is a little bit of an immaturity to limerence, a sort of shallowness, more steeped in fantasy than reality. It feels more like 8th grade than it feels like an adult relationship. But if a person has a propensity towards limerence, then they will actually be in really big trouble when they meet a narcissistic person. Because the limerent person, in their own way, actually does their own love bombing. They make up the fantasy. They live in the obsession. They run the risk of doing really foolish, foolhardy things to win the narcissistic person over. It's like the narcissistic person doesn't even need to love bomb someone who is prone to limerence. The limerent person is already doing more than half the work. And that sort of push-pull, in and out, sometimes interested, sometimes not quality of the narcissistic relationship can wreak havoc with a limerent person who may get obsessively focused and fantastical about the tiny bits of validation and excitement and continue to construct this sort of infatuated narrative. A limerent person who meets a narcissist can easily become so obsessed that they will completely check out of their own lives and may stay in a very invalidating relationship because the limerent person may endure a lot of bad treatment to keep the love object close by. My verdict is that limerence and narcissistic relationships do not and will not mix well. The obsessiveness of the love-bombed, trauma-bonded relationship is bad enough, but when you throw on the obsessive, infatuated fantasy play of limerence, it can get someone into a really bad cycle that they may incredibly struggle with getting out of. While limerence for people who do not have histories of trauma bonding or who are not in a narcissistic relationship will sort of usually play itself out, fizzle and die. When narcissism comes into the picture, that fade out may not take place, and the love-bombed, obsessive quality that characterizes narcissistic relationships may keep the limerent dynamic in place for a long and unhealthy time. When I did this research, I sat down and thought, do I know anyone limerent? And I recognized I did know a few limerent people in my time. I found them to be dreamy, mercurial, almost charmingly childlike people about love and relationships. But they were also obsessive and at times impulsive. I did feel like I'd stepped into a time machine and was listening to a 14-year-old talk about a new crush rather than an adult talking about a new relationship. These were relationships where these limerent people I knew would disappear into the new limerent relationship and would only resurface and get back in touch once it ran its course. In almost all cases, these people also had some kind of loss, trauma, or instability in their early lives. As I read it, limerence is sort of the diet soda of love. It tastes good, but it's less filling. Limerence isn't love. It's very obsessive, infatuated fantasy. It's not reciprocal. It's not really based in things like compassion, commitment, consistency, companionship, the things that are essential for a healthy relationship. But unfortunately, this limerent dynamic, kind of almost fully unformed, kind of adult love, can really get tricky when it hits up against the superficial kind of intimacy we see in a narcissistic relationship of any kind. So pay attention if this is the kind of dynamic you're prone to. A narcissistic relationship could get real tricky for you real fast. Those are my thoughts. Thanks again.